This presentation, titled Cultural Evidence Helping Organizations Reflect, comes to us from Kurt Stuke. Kurt has more than 20 years of experience within the quality, process improvement, operational excellence, and leadership fields. He is an adjunct faculty member at New England College, SNHU, the community college system of New Hampshire. He's also a corporate trainer with a passion for finding creative ways to drive positional change. His work has been published in the Journal of Quality and Participation, the Open Journal for Business and Management, the ASQ Lean Division newsletter, the ASQ Audit Division newsletter, and most recently in the Lean E-Zine Perspective. Recent speaking engagements include the Lean and Six Sigma World Conference, the Quality Show, the ASQ World Conference, BossCon, the NECQ, and more. And with that, take it away, Kurt.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Cultural Evidence. The inspiration for this particular webinar comes from the observation that we think culture, we sense culture is really important. Most of us have heard the quotation attributed to Drucker that says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So we know in some level, at some form, that this is important stuff. But one of the issues that we face as auditors, quality professionals, is how do we actually borrow a page from the social sciences? How can we incorporate these formalized ways of looking at culture and make them part of our day-to-day? That's the point of this particular seminar. As I go through, let me give you the agenda. I know I prefer having a map given to me so that I can make sense of what's to follow. What I will do is I'll go through these 5 cultural elements, and I'll try to explain what they are. First, I'll define them, makes sense, right? And then I'll explain how we might be able to possibly use these in our work. And I'll also include one possible places that you can look for these particular things. And also note on the nifty graphic on the screen here, I've given you a picture of culture, but I want to first start by making a distinction between the material and the non-material. Sometimes the non-material is labeled as the symbolic. And I know what you're thinking, like, how in the world can I bring that into my work? I think there are concrete, specific, and measurable ways, and I'm going to try to talk to that. And just to get the party started here, I think we do a great job with the material side of cultural elements. Where we can improve is the non-material. And while it's always good to improve and to move forward, the reason we ought to consider the non-material is because it's so influential in driving organizations. If we're really going to offer a full-fledged, accurate assessment, we ought to be considering those non-material elements as well as the material elements. So that's what's happening. That's what's heading your way. And let's go on now to values. So have you ever walked in, maybe during an auditing gig, and the first thing you see in a company's foyer is a value statement? And more often than not, sometimes it's a very, very neat, eye-appealing encapsulation of what this company values. And then as you go on and you do your thing for the next day, 2, 3, 4 weeks, whatever, however big this particular gig is, you note that what was written in that foyer is not necessarily what's in the heart and soul of the people walking in the hallways, right? So that's an important observation, and it also speaks to the importance of values. Let's note that this is part of that non-material or symbolic layer. Although it's possible to try to express and articulate that which is non-material, this is something that is more ephemeral and lives and breathes and moves and changes. So it's a moving target, I admit that, but the best way to define what it is that we're talking about is to define this as a standard of what is desirable or undesirable. And that's what we mean when we say, this is what I value. Most companies will have a value statement, either as part of the quality manual or as part of the strategic vision or mission of the organization in and of itself. This is important stuff. It's not just that which is suitable for your moral, or something on the back of a business card. Sometimes on business cards, you'll find a vision statement. Note that there are two flavors here, the espoused versus the enacted. And this is where it gets really important. We can have really high, lofty, espoused values. These are the talking the talk, if you will. These are the aspirations that are written on paper and show the aspirational values, the standards of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what is desirable, what is undesirable. But the walking the walk, this is the enacted level. There are many companies that have both espoused and then a gap, mind the gap, between the espoused and the enacted values. And let me give you Exhibit A, Enron. They had a wonderful, I don't know if you've scoured YouTube and looked at Enron's orientation videos or some of the actual value statement, value mission type videos that they've posted. They're there. Unfortunately, they're like almost inescapable. They're accessible if you want to go see them. They're wonderful. This sounds like a wonderful company to work for. But there was a gap between the aspirational, the talking to the talk level of values versus what was actually acceptable. So in our work, I think looking at that gap, and why would we do that? Well, if we want to move the current state to the future state, or if we're simply making assessments on a third-party basis, this is useful information. For example, sometimes when we look at kappa, right? And sometimes kappa is just left there on the plate, time after time after time, or we'll ding. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that word. If we score as non-compliant, a certain element, and then the next time we come back, maybe it's a surveillance and we're coming back in a year, right? It's still there. What does that tell us about the company? Now, we can look for commitment of the C-suite to driving the quality in the QMS, but the values, the lived values, the enacted values tell us from the outside in what exactly is probably going to happen. And note that really what I'm talking about now, when I'm borrowing a page from the social sciences, is sort of the introduction of qualitative data, as well as, I'm not saying ignore the quant, keep the quantitative data, keep those high confidence stats, let them be there and let those measurements be concrete, specific, and measurable, lower that margin of error, of course. But there's something very powerful about looking at these symbolic levels of an organizational culture and helping us assess what exactly is going on, and they're predictive as well. We can look at what's going to happen going down the road. So that's why I'm asking, maybe we can coin a term here, the anthroquality, right? So I'm truncating anthropology and putting it into juxtaposition with what we do, quality. So anthroquality, I don't know if that will fly, but you're my first audience to hear that term. That's what I'm talking about. I want you to consider the influential that is often put aside, because I think there are insights, specifically with this, with knowing what a company will say is good, is bad, is to be valued, or is to be rejected. And specifically, I want you to look at how far is that enacted from the espoused. So that's what I would say about values. Again, you can look at the company foyer when you walk in and see that value statement, the back of a business card. You'll often find it written and articulated in many different places, but that's the starting point. That's not the ending point. Seeing what exactly that company values, both through that which is said and behaviors, which I'm going to get into norms in a second, that's really helpful in constructing a full and informed understanding of the culture that we're auditing. Now, I mentioned that behavior, that moving from the stated and looking at what is valued to actual behaviors. Norms flow from values. values are the font from which norms are, rise, right? So we're still in part of that non-material or symbolic layer. I know this is uncomfortable. I know this is something that we tend to go past. And part of the problem is it's hard to measure. In our field, we're trained, look, give us a metric and let us put it in paper. Let's measure it from, say, start to finish or from whatever period you're in. And admittedly, as non-material things, these are more difficult to find, to identify, and then to measure, but it's so worth it. So we're staying within that non-material level. And let's define norms. I promised in the agenda that I would define each of these terms because they are somewhat different than what we're used to. These are the expectations of right behaviors. If you're driving in the United States, the norm is when you drive, you're on the right side of the road. If you're in Australia, you're on the left side of the road, right? These are really important norms to follow. Did you know when you walk in the States, you walk on the right side? Isn't it funny how these norms have a ripple effect? And we could go more into, what is a norm and how they differ from culture to culture, but the same thing happens within organizations. We have expectations of right behavior, and these define so much of what's going to happen and what is not going to happen. And just like with norms, or values where we had the espoused, aspirational versus the enacted, the lived, here you find norms at all, it's multivariate, at all the different levels that take place within an organization. They can be at the task level. Most importantly, they can be at the process level. We love our process flows, don't we? Change management. Have you noticed how some cultures, some organizations, and when I say culture, I'm talking about the organizational culture now, some are open to change management and some, yeah, not so much. You'll even see it in the social level of who's accepted, who isn't accepted, who's brought into the in groups and who's outside of the groups. And in a later slide, I'll talk about internal group dynamics and how that is something that we can be looking at to get a more informed picture of what it is we're talking about. Risk and the tolerance of a company toward risk is also another huge part of what a norm is. Now you're saying, oh, it's somewhat informative, but how do I go? Where do I go to see these things? Well, this is more of a between the lines kind of element, a cultural element. You don't find people saying, all right, well, when it comes to change management, let's be closed. Although sometimes you may actually find policies or written statements, emails, which are more informal than written policies and procedures, in which that sort of sentiment is expressed. It's rare because most people realize in an email, it's material. It could be brought into a court case, or it could be made evidence. So most people are very cautious in what they say and what they write. But where you can find norms are through observation. Now, most of us, when we take our guided tour, maybe it's a new gig we haven't been to, or we just want to get caught up, and if there's been any changes. If you're in the lean side of things, then of course you know about Go to Gemba, right? That's where you see what's up. That's where you get the real feel for what's happening. And when you're on the floor, you should be looking for the interactions and the behavioral exchanges, but also what we could be looking for are what are the expectations between the management and the employees, between the employees themselves. Are people open? We're going to come in, we're going to put a lot of time and effort to measuring. We're going to assign, if you're third party, okay, someone do the root cause analysis. Knowing what the norms are might help us tailor our root cause analysis focuses, or when we're deciding whether or not to accept CAPA, right? Now, if we can understand the expectations of right behavior, maybe we know who to go to in order to suggest ways to enable the culture to come around to understand the importance of quality. Maybe that's not your job, but maybe it is. I was a first party person, so it was my gig. That's what I'm suggesting. These norms, they're far more powerful than, say, the process guide that's taped. These guide people, and sometimes we're not even aware. It's more of a folklore that's passed on worker to worker to worker. And in order to get accepted, you accept the norms. You want to have a decent quality of life while you're doing your thing. And norms and the acceptance of norms is one way that workers do that. So understanding the role that these norms are playing is really important for us to understand the culture that we're assessing. Now, this one might be the biggest ask. This is a stretch, all right? I admit it. This is not something that I'm aware that a lot of people are going toward, but I want to encourage, just hear me out and let me try to explain why the fancy word is narratives. Stories works, doesn't it? Why are stories so darn powerful, and how possible to use stories or organizational narratives to understand the groups that we're coming to terms with? First, once again, we're in that non-material symbolic layer. So we're far from home, but I think there's some value here. And let me try to explain that. Here is a quote from Margaret Wheatley. She was an organizational scholar back in '92. She begged leadership to go from an enlightenment mindset where reality was linear, well-behaved, and we could go from cause to effect all the time, and the movement from cause to effect was always proportional. Well, gee whiz, she argued, in the life sciences, when we look at, say, complex adaptive systems and emergence, sometimes small things have disproportionately large impacts. So this was her 90, but she has also done additional work. She's a scientist, by the way, by training, and now a poet and an organizational scholar. She notes, she sees the importance of stories. Think about it in your families, in your personal lives. Like, we use stories to make sense, and that's an important word from the social sciences. We make sense of what's happening around us through the retelling of stories. Stories allow us to create a fabric which interprets purpose and significance in a way that we can get our heads around and our hearts around. It speaks to the entirety of the being. That's the importance of what a story can do. There's something human about hearing a story and being moved. If I take out a 50-page quality manual, and I know they exist, they exist, you've probably seen them, and I start reading, oh, okay. Chances are, well, we're pretty anal, so we'll probably go through the entirety of the 50 pages, no problem. But most normal people, right, are gonna get lost somewhere on the 5th to 10th page, if we're being honest. But stories grab us. And in this next graphic, right, Paul Smith has written, actually, he has a top 10 list. I've truncated it to 5, knowing that as humans, we probably do have a shorter attention span. So I want to capitalize on that. Why a story is so powerful? Why should we care? As auditors, quality professionals, process improvers, why should we care about stories? They're simple, right? Have you ever written either an executive summary that got too in-depth and went too far into the details? Have you ever written an email or received an email from some, perhaps up or downstream, and it was too much, just a 1,500 word email that went into way too much detail? Simplicity is good. Simplicity, let's go to that third bullet. It's easy to remember. So there's something about stories that helps us escape that, that granularity that can become a barrier to understanding, and a barrier, most importantly, to action. A good story is timeless. If I say, bring up the image of sitting by the campfire the hook. I think all of us know that story. And maybe this is a US thing, but there's a campfire story we tell to our kids about a car, and it's a scary story because, of course, kids around the campfire are going to want to be scared while you're cooking your s'mores. I don't know if I've gone too cultural on you, but this is something we do. We take joy in scaring our children, right? So we tell them a scary story about a bunch of people that were camping just like us, and then they heard a scratching on the campfire, so they got into the car, and the next morning they noticed a hook stuck in the door. All of you know this story, or at least most of you do. This is timeless. This is stuff that my dad was told by his dad, and so on. And it's generational, it's passed on. So it's simple, it's easy to remember. The most important thing about stories, like if I bring in a policy, if I bring in a citation, oh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to ding you on this, and this is a formal, it's gonna go on your permanent record, then, well, you're gonna have one reaction. If I'm telling you a story, then you open up as a person. That's important. And there's something about that openness that gives us an in. So we can use, by the way, stories in two important ways. We can use it as we sit back and listen and hear the stories or read the stories, and all organizations have their stories. And secondly, we can use stories to show the importance, to inspire, literally to breathe into. What good is a scorecard if it's not prompting action? So maybe in that meeting after the audit has occurred, having some stories of, oh, here's the success that I noted as a result of this. You know, that's something that's going to open and spur the imagination of the audience. So again, you have a twofold application of stories. One is to learn about the organization. Again, this is that symbolic layer that we don't necessarily, I'm not saying never, I'm just saying we don't necessarily pay attention to this. And let me tell you about the types of stories there are. There are creation stories, sometimes known as a creation myth. A myth doesn't mean it's false, it just means it's a way of making sense. Right? That's the technical understanding or definition of a myth. Every company in the world, most companies in the world, have creation myths, creation stories. Our company rose from the ashes and was based upon the vision of our founder, so-and-so, who back in this time overcame the odds and set us on a path to footprint dominance, market share, domination. So does this sound familiar? And then another type of story might be the competition story. How did we get to the point where, or what about our silly, dull-witted competitors that never come to us? Or how about the intra-company myths and stories, narratives that are told in which one group is depicted as dull-witted and the other group are the saviors of the company? Understanding the dynamics between the groups, particularly through the stories, and a lot of these are water cooler, bubbler, things that are said, and sometimes you don't get an entire story. Wouldn't it be great? Like when you sit with your kids or your grandkids and you get a once upon a time, okay, well that's, you're getting a story. You don't always have that clarification when you're doing anthro-quality research in the wild. Sometimes you have to sit back and understand, okay, what I'm hearing now is how this company, specifically this group, makes sense, perhaps of the quality group. And maybe this is why kappa is repeated and repeated. Lather, rinse, and repeat. That's a shampoo joke. So understanding how the other groups see each other, using their stories as evidence, or how about we're supposed to document the dedication and devotion and commitment of top management to driving the QMS and the quality mission in general, right? And so sometimes we'll use emails and attendance at meetings. Okay, I mean, I'm just saying that's a little thin. I realize that the advantage here is it's documentable. There's a trail, fair enough. get it, and that's what really counts. If you can put it on paper, you can measure it, right? I believe Deming said something along those lines. But the stories that are told are far more telling than whether or not someone attended a meeting on a regular basis or documenting like a feedback loop, right? The stories that the people that you're interviewing, and you have lots of interviews as you go through your audits, the stories that are told are not fodder. They're not just, hey, I'm going to let you talk for 5 minutes so that you're at ease, because I've been trained to make sure that you don't see me as adversarial, and therefore I'll get better data. But the stories are not something that we should discard readily. They're something that we should consider. Most of these are going to be told verbally, but some of them are actually on paper, and some you can see. I'm going to talk about artifacts in a second. Some you can see in the artwork that the company has depicted when being self-referential and talking about who and what they are and what their character is. Those darn values, the espoused values, there's a story there. How did they come up with those values? Are they just following the footprints of the other? And there you go. Now you've got an insight into the fabric. If they're lemmings and following what the other companies in that sector are doing, that's an important piece for you to know to truly understand what it is that you're measuring, right? So those are the stories. I find stories really interesting. They come in similar categories, but they are very different, and when we use them as a mirror and reflect back upon what it is that we're looking at, the culture that we're studying. All right. Now, I mentioned artifacts. We're moved now to the material. We're in that material, really concrete layer that we're really good at. And these are the physical signs, typically of an organization's dominant culture. Let me stop there and just explain. Not every organization has one specific culture and everyone is on board. Sometimes you can have a pluralistic setting in which there's one and perhaps another subdominant culture. And sometimes it's a salad bowl where you have lots of different cultures, and just like each element of a salad adds a specific flavor, right? Those flavors are welcomed and they're put together and they make the richness of that culture up. But more often than not, specifically in the dysfunctional organizations, you'll see one power, one dominant culture, and this dictates what's up and get on board or get out. So those are the ways of understanding cultures, and that's the difference between a sort of monoculture, a pluralistic culture, and a salad bowl culture. Now, what might an artifact be? We look at the quality manual, don't we? The QMS in and of itself is an artifact. We're really good at vivisecting, maybe dissecting the QMS. Certifications that are appropriate, that are relevant, we know about these. This is something that is absolutely in our sweet spot, as we say, something that we've been trained. We know about policies. We know about policies and procedures. Sure, this is all good stuff. It should be included. But have you ever considered the layout and the condition? I know some auditors that are on the ISO side of things, and they do take this into consideration. So if you walk into especially a highly regulated sector and you're seeing warning signs of neglect, specifically in how the physical conditioning of the space is, well, that's a warning sign, isn't it? Or how about security? I have some auditors who shall remain nameless that will go around a factory during their lunch and see if there's any way in that should not be allowed, right? So layout and condition, I'm using it as an umbrella term, which refers to not only how well the space is maintained, but the care that is given to each of these spaces. The activities that happen. Have you ever been on a gig, ever been on an audit, and noticed that more people, as you are walking the space, are perhaps on their phone, on the, maybe playing an iOS game, or by the water cooler, or they park as far as they possibly can because they don't want to be there. That's going to get into my next one in a second. But what are the activities? And during the activities, let's say there's meeting. Is this a death by meeting type culture? Sometimes that's a barrier to improvement, right? Is this people are on the phone or Zooming constantly? And I do realize in this day of COVID, sometimes you're not going to get to a space. You're just not, and most of the people, if you even got there, would be remote. What about as you talk to people? Like, how are they reacting to this particular remote situation? Is that something that is wearing? Is this something that's going to be a barrier to what it is that we need to do? So the activities in the post-pandemic world and in the pandemic world themselves are telling, and they are included as part of this material layer, and they should be part of your assessment, if not formally, then informally. Get to as informed an understanding of the culture as you possibly can in order to understand what it is that you're measuring, is the bottom line. Now, I mentioned mood and affect, and I know some of you are scratching your head and going back to maybe undergrad psych, uni psych, but it's important. And I realize nowadays over Zoom, it's hard to really get a true understanding, a true feeling, pun intended, for mood and affect. But have you been in companies where everyone is dour? Everyone does not want to be there. Right? Lunch hours are extended. Deadlines are never met. As you come in as a third party and you try to enter the building, right, it's clear that you're not welcome. So these things are important. And how about, not only you're not welcome, but you sit down at your first interview, notice the desk is just trashed. Right? This is a way to combine some of the different artifacts. You might not have considered these artifacts, but they reflect the culture, the material culture, forgive me, and they're important to note. And once again, I'm not saying ignore the stuff that we traditionally focus on. This is more of a yes and exercise. Try to add on these other things because they will help you understand what it is that you are attempting to assess. I think we've all measured goals, and maybe it's specific to the QMS or specific to improvements that were cited. Maybe in some instances we're looking at strategic goals. It depends on what your gig is and what it is that you're doing. We know about goals. They reflect the purpose and the aspirations, and we've looked at vision statements. We've looked at mission statements. What we haven't looked at as much as is power and authority. I know we're trained to ensure that there's top-down support for the QMS, but understanding, using the other elements that I just spoke about, and try to see not just the org chart, that nice linear description of how power is supposed to be structured, but how does it actually flow? Once again, I started, so long ago, talking about values and the difference between espoused and enacted, and between the talk and the talk, the walk and the walk, the aspiration and the lived. Power and authority structures and flows are exactly the same. It doesn't always flow the way that the org chart says it does. I'm not sure the actual worth of the org chart, other than, hey, at least they put some thought into how this ought to go, right? So that's good, that's suggestive. But actually looking at the network itself, doing perhaps a organizational network analysis or a social network analysis, and understanding who are the mavens, those that really have the knowledge and who are brokering it in order to get the job done. Knowing where those power and authority centers lie, that's far more helpful than understanding, look, on the org chart, this is a traditional hierarchy. No, right? There's always the go-to people in the groups, understanding who they are, how accurate they are, and what they're trying to do, what their values might be, how do they fit in culturally? Are they part of the in-group? Are they part of the out-group? Because that matters. If they're part of the out-group and they're giving guidance, this is going to lead to dissonance. This might be one reason why Kappa just doesn't go away year after year after year. So power and authority, understanding group dynamics are important. And there it is, the organizational structure. We can look at this also. You know, there's a move now to flatten organizational structures, to compress them. If we can't get away from an outright hierarchy, perhaps we can get rid of middle layers and make the communication channels more vibrant between the top and the bottom. Okay, but how is it really working? And is the structure that's touted as you perhaps open to page 5 of the quality manual, like, is it the one that's lived? And what do we do when it's not? To accept it as face value, prima facie, might not be prudent, and it might lead us down a wrong path, where maybe if we went in a different direction, we would be helping that client more effectively. And once again, this really boils down to something I'm not sure many of us are looking at, and if you are, please forgive me, but organizational dynamics, the play between in and out groups, between cliques, between cultures. What are the tensions, and how do these things affect the outputs? Because that's what we care about, input to output. We're process level folks typically. Organizational dynamics are not accidental. They're primary drivers. They're absolutely influential in a company realizing its CTQs, its critical qualities. And you might say, okay, well, this is interesting, but like, how does it start from goals, and where do we get it? Or where do we gather this sort of thing? Again, sometimes goals, more often than values and norms, are going to be written down. They're going to be articulated. They could be in the quality manual. They could be in policies and procedures. They could be in emails from the top down. They could be on cubes, if you're in a cube farm, or they could be on the floor. There could be something that's hinted at as you're talking to the escort and walking around. It takes, to do qualitative research is hard, and it would take a dedicated course in going from a center on quantitative to a center on qualitative. But what it takes is a willingness to look at and to observe and to record, if necessary, that which is observed, and that which is observed both non-verbally and verbally. Did you know, for example, that it's estimated up to 75–80% of what is communicated between humans is not said, it's nonverbal. So much of what we can be doing throughout all of these elements, not just specific to goals, is cueing in on the nonverbal, cueing in on the common ways that we express without saying a word. And that's what I'm urging and encouraging, is an openness to the symbolic, to the non-uttered, right? The nonverbal. So here we are at the summary. Again, we have explored the material and the non-material levels. We started with values, that is how a company defines what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. Went to beliefs or norms, which are at the behavioral level, that which is accepted, that which is not accepted. I looked at organizational narratives, how they come in different genres and how they could be leveraged. We looked to artifacts, and I suggested that artifacts are not just policies and procedures, process flows, but could encompass more. And finally, we finished with goals. So I'm going to turn it back now to Michael.
Thank you, Kurt Stuke, for that enlightening look at cultural considerations that auditors and organizations must recognize. And that concludes this presentation.